Well, guys, I've already broken my promise. Day one of the trial, and I've already broken my promise. Oh, goodness. So let's get into it. Welcome to True Crime, Faith, and Chocolate. I'm your host, Annette Lyon, true crime junkie, woman of faith, and USA Today bestselling author of the suspense novel Just One More and a whole bunch of other books. Today's chocolate is Cadbury Royal Dark Black Forest Cherry, which we will try in a little bit. Okay, so today we had our opening statements and our first witness. I'll put up a list of timestamps. So if you're watching the East Idaho news stream after the fact, you can find these things quickly. You can jump forward to all the different steps. I watched all 7+ hours, so you don't have to. So here's the deal. You can also, I think Nate Eaton said that they'll be chopping it up and kind of putting them into their own videos. So if you can watch those separately, that's great too. So if you are going to go to the live stream, just jump ahead to minute 33 because nothing happens. They started the stream, they're in court, but they're waiting and waiting and waiting. Nothing actually happens till 33 minutes in. The jury comes in, they're sworn in, the judge gives them all their instructions. Nothing too exciting there. The one instruction I found interesting was number 7, if I recall, I wrote it down correctly, that Judge Boyce said if he says or does anything to imply or to make them think that he is favoring one side over the other, to disregard it because he's trying to be as impartial and objective as possible. Then he read the indictment, which he made a point of several times, saying this is not evidence. This is just explaining why we're here, the charges that have been leveled, but of course the presumption of innocence and all of that good stuff. And he also made a point of saying that the opening statements are not to be considered evidence. They are just opening statements. So do not consider them to be evidence. I really appreciated how Rob Wood of the prosecution, he's the one who did the opening statement, he framed it as a book, which is a fitting, rather apropos, considering Chad is a writer-ish. Not great, but he's a writer. He likes to pretend he is anyway. So Rob Wood, he described things as chapter 1, da-da-da, chapter 2, da-da-da. And his entire statement began with 2 dead children. And of course, referring to Tylee and JJ, who were buried in Chad's backyard. He talks about having the next month, his wife dies in their bed, and then 17 days later, he's photographed on the beaches of Hawaii, newly married to Lori Vallow. And then he reiterated what the opening statement for Lori's trial, which is done by Lindsay Blake, who is now the lead prosecutor on this case. Money, sex, and power, that those are the motivations. But he also said that Chad did not want to be ordinary, and that he was addicted and just obsessed with the fact that Lori was attracted to him, that he just couldn't get enough. He wanted to be special, which so plays into his whole prophet self-complex thing. He talks about, yes, they had an affair when they were both still married, and he says Chad's own words will convict him, which I thought was fascinating. We also know, he kind of hinted at some of this, but we know that, from things that have come out since, this was not in his statement, but we do know that Chad has a history of wooing vulnerable women, and convincing them of his spiritual whatever. He, of his visions and whatnot. He apparently had some things with Julie Rowe, and apparently he had his eye on Melanie Gibb until Hillary came along. So Rob Wood, he lays out other things about how the insurance fraud, how their wedding rings were purchased when Tammy was still alive, communications between Chad and Lori about Charles dying with bullets before he ever died, Tammy being shot at, Brandon Boudreaux being shot at, and finally the welfare check that was done at JJ's grandmother case request, the end of November 2019, all of that stuff. And he says, he closed it by basically saying, you, the jury, will write the final chapter and hopefully decide that the justice will come to Tammy, Tylee, and JJ. So I thought that was a really cool way of wrapping the whole thing up. They had a break then the defense had their opening statement, and well, John Fryer, I'm already not a huge fan. Let's just, he introduced himself about, I guess, that he's the Chad's defense, blah blah blah. And then he gives like a kind of a generic, very whitewashed, very, of course, positive biography of Chad. And he talks about how he went on a mission. I'm not really sure what that means, but like first church or something. And that was such a way of saying, oh, by the way, jury, I'm not a Latter-day Saint. It's like, if you've been talking to Chad for years, you've been preparing for this case solidly for over a year, you know what an LDS mission is. Give me a break, dude. But I think that was his way of kind of winking at the jury and saying, oh, I'm not of that faith, so I can be impartial or whatever. And of course, he said, don't speculate, focus on the facts, which, I agree with. He gave kind of a very brief history of Tammy and Chad's life together, very brief and very, daisies and rainbows. He talks about how they set up their own publishing company, which we know they did, which also went belly up because they were only making a few $1,000s a year. So the first statement from Fires that made me laugh, I was like, oh, dude, if I wrote this down correctly, this is what he said. He goes, this publishing company basically published books. You think? Just, dude, like, give me a break. Anyway, then he said that he's off peddling his books at these seminars to make a living for his family. And I wanted to just call BS right there, because I've been in the LDS publishing market. I know how big his publishing company was. Tiny. I know how much a decent publisher can sell, a bigger publisher. I know how much people make. I know how many books can sell. This is not Simon and Schuster, okay? I know there's no way he was making a living off of these books being sold at seminars. He was stroking his ego because he got attention for being a prophet and being visionary and all of these great things. And one thing I find interesting too, in the Latter-day Saint tradition, is viewed, for better or worse, and some of this has shifted over the years, but generally speaking, is considered the man's responsibility to provide for the family. And it's becoming more and more acceptable for women to have their own careers and all of that good stuff. But the husband is supposed to be the one to make sure that the finances, family is taken care of, doesn't go off into a ditch. And yet throughout their entire marriage, from what I can tell, Chad always made Tammy be the one to make sure that there was food on the table and a roof over their heads, that they had benefits and all of that. So I'm like, so a way to be a righteous Latter-day Saint, dude. If he's self-proclaimed righteous man, he should be doing some of the things that are expected of a righteous LDS man. John Pryor says that he wrote and published things that were in line with his religion. And I wanted to throw a flag there and go, only at first. He very quickly ran off into a ditch. He was kind of in line when he was publishing Suzanne Friedman's book. I would highly recommend looking up her 2-part interview with Hidden True Crime. And she herself saw that Chad was going off the rails. And she was like, I'm not comfortable with this. I can't publish you with you anymore. And she actually said something to the effect, and she forgot she said this, so she looked back years later after all Tammy died. She saw her own email to him saying there's going to be death and destruction as a result of and I think at the time she meant spiritually, metaphorically, but she goes, wow, that was a little eerie. But he very quickly went off the rails into various things. John Pryor says Lori pursued him, that he was intoxicated on that, and he spent a long time then going off into Lori's past and her history and saying, oh, she's had all these marriages. She did. She was a hot mess in a lot of ways, but and basically saying it was everything is Lori's fault. Well, let's look at Chad. All he had was a speeding ticket. He just never done anything wrong. He and Tammy been together all these years, and yes, they had an affair, but see, Chad was very good at making himself look a certain way publicly. And I'll get into some of those things a little bit later on another video, but basically saying just because Chad only had a speeding ticket on the record does not mean he was a good guy, and does not mean he wasn't complicit in this case. So then John Pryor goes into some of the witnesses he will be calling, which is new. We didn't have any witnesses in Lori's case from the defense. So he says he'll be bringing in a DNA expert and somehow that is going to be relevant that Chad's DNA didn't show up somewhere. That didn't, a lack of something doesn't mean someone's innocent, just saying. He is also going to be bringing in someone, an expert, just tell us why it is so significant that we don't know how Tylee died. We do know that her body was it was dismembered and burned, and there were bones missing, and there's evidence on her bones of certain attacks, kind of a thing. So we don't know specifically what killed her. There wasn't enough evidence left to know that, but it is said that the manner of death was homicide. Doesn't in my mind it doesn't really matter specifically how she died. It was probably violent and painful, but I don't know why he thinks it's so important to know how. Then he says that several of their kids will be testifying. He said 3 or 4 of the 5, I believe, and supposedly about Tammy's being sick. And supposedly the fact that she's taking herbal remedies and oils, I assume essential oils, that somehow indicates that she had some illnesses going on. And then that would explain her sudden death. And she didn't like going to doctors. Okay, so having a mother who's big into herbal things and essential oils and all of that, I can tell you that has nothing to do with someone being ready to just fall asleep and never wake up. A lot of people use oils for a lot of things, and a lot of people have chronic things. I have some chronic conditions of my own. None of them are going to make me just suddenly not wake up one morning. Something else had to have been going on. Plus the fact that her autopsy specifically said she died of asphyxiation. And she had bruises that indicate she was being restrained. Lavender oil doesn't do that, guys. Sorry, that's just... John Parr goes on to implicate a lot of things with Alex, which is really frustrating to me. Anyway, so then after that was basically the end of the defense's opening statement. They had a break. Then we have the state's case begins with witness number 1. We had Rexburg detective Ray Hermosillo, who just testified in Lori's case as well. He was on the stand for an entire day with Lori. He took up the rest of the day with some breaks in between and whatnot. He talks about how he was first entered into the case when Arizona police, can't remember if it was Gilbert or Chandler, but one of them called and said, we believe there's a Jeep that might be in Rexburg that's connected to a homicide case that we're investigating here. That was Charles's death, and it was the Jeep that Tylee drove. So Detective Hermosillo finds the Jeep, does some surveillance, and in that process, this is, November 1st-ish, I think, of 2019. He says, so they're surveying the townhouses where Lori, her brother Alex, and then her niece Melanie Boudreau were living, having moved up from Arizona. He sees Lori and Chad several times. Never sees the children, of course. By this point, they've been dead for quite some time, since September-ish. And then we get the stupidest objection I've ever heard. At one point, he says, hearsay! John Pryor yells, hearsay, objection, hearsay. And no, so hearsay itself is a valid objection. Hearsay is that, it's something you heard somebody else reported someone saying that you didn't observe it or hear it yourself. And you don't want that in court, of course, because you need to have things that are factual. You can't play that the game of telephone where things change the more they're repeated along the line. But he said hearsay, and then Detective Hermosillo kind of was like, I'm quoting myself. These are the words that I said. This is not hearsay by any definition, dude. I think you learned that probably on day 1 in law school. Get a clue. The other frustrating thing for me with his other objection that was so stupid, he was complaining about the use of the word yard. They had a picture, a Google map overview of the Daybell property, and they were kind of explaining where things were and things that had happened. And he just went off about how, so apparently some of the Daybell property went beyond this area. That's more acres or something. And so they're calling this area the yard. And he was objecting because yard implies grass. And there's not grass over all of that area. What? Seriously, it took several minutes for people to go, what is he even talking about? That's the stupidest objection. Just because I'm petty and snarky today, I had to look it up. And no, in fact, yard does not have to have grass. There's one of the four definitions that says usually with grass, but it can also just be even a paved area, enclosed area near buildings. And that's not going into the adjective or the verb, which have nothing to do with grass, or the other noun referring to different measurements, and even like a cubic yard or a yard stick. And then there was even a definition about a certain kind of like a wine glass or something, or an ale glass, certain shape. And then I think there was even a plant that wasn't grass, something. Anyway, there's just so many things that have nothing to do with grass, dude. Why are you objecting? He was also objecting about various pictures and saying, how do we know this picture was taken? This is the crime scene, or this is how the way it actually looked? And did you take this photo yourself? And he's like, well, no, I didn't take it, but I was the crime scene right there. Well, who did? And he's like, I don't remember the person who took that picture. So you weren't there? No, I was there. So people were, what, traipsing in and out of this crime scene? No, it's a closed crime scene. But I don't remember who the photographer was that day. And I might have been in the kitchen and this is the person in the hall or whatever it was. But it was just sort of, all of his objections were just overruled. Most of them I can, I get why they're doing it. The photo ones, fine. If that's going to help your case. And so he can't be appealed party on. But the yard bit and the hearsay when it's his own words were just like, oh, prayer. So we go into discussing the warrant that was served on June 9th, 2020. And that is when they found the children's bodies in Chad's yard. The warrant was served at 7 a.m. His son Mark came to the door. I believe he said it was Mark. And Chad's asleep. Oh, my dad's asleep. We'll wake him up. We need to talk to him. Apparently, Chad was sleeping in a loft area. It sounded like it was above the garage, not in like the primary parent's bedroom. So they didn't go dig into that. And I'm curious as to why was he not sleeping in the main bedroom? Was it because guilt? He couldn't get himself to sleep in there after Tammy died? I don't know. I'm just curious. I have no idea, but it seemed odd to me. He makes a phone call. They let him get dressed. He makes a phone call to his lawyer. They let him speak to his lawyer privately in the kitchen. Then he wants to make another phone call, and they say, well, he wants to go outside to do that. They said, well, someone has to go with you. So Hermosillo goes out to go with him, and Chad gets into his car for privacy and makes the phone call, which has got to be the call that we've heard many times when he called Lori in jail. And that's the one where he's like, yeah, well, they're searching the property, and we'll see what happens. And then there's all the love you, babe, and I'll pray for you, and blah, blah, blah. Hermosillo says at one point, Chad looks over his shoulder and looks really nervous, and detective looks over, is he looking? And he was looking over his shoulder at the trees and pond area of the yard. And later on, that is where they found JJ's body. They didn't say that to the jury yet, but that is what we know. So, and I will say, actually, when they were looking with the whole Jeep and all of that, when he saw Chad and he saw Alex, Lori, at one point he's talking to Chad, and he actually says, do you know Lori Vallow? And he says, oh, I've met her a couple times. I don't know her that well. You have her phone number? No. He's married to her by this point, guys. So lying through his teeth. Detective eventually goes out to help with sifting through things in the fire pit, and then he moves over to help the evidence recovery team, the ERT from the FBI, who were they had asked to be brought in to help out with the case. They saw some area of the ground that looked disturbed. It didn't look like it matched everything else, so they targeted that 6x6 area, moving a shrub, top layer of grass and soil. Then they see 3 big white rocks, and he says at that point he could already smell the smell of human decomposition. And then there are 2 pieces of wood paneling. They moved those, and the more they pulled out, the stronger that smell got. And he knows that smell because he smelled it many times as a police officer in various situations, various cases. After they pulled out the wood paneling, the dirt is discolored and it's moist. It's clearly been disturbed. As they're brushing away the soil, they see a round black object. As they clear out some more, it looks like the crown of a head. There's that shape. They realize it's black plastic. So carefully, to not hurt anything inside, they slit it open, and they see white plastic. So they slit that open, and they see brown hair. We know that is JJ. They had found JJ's body at that point, but they don't. That's as far as they went. All they said at that point was that I guess the call had went up. They found something, and Chad had been. I guess there's a kitty corner. His daughter lived. He went to go see her, and when he realized they had found something, he jumped in his car and took off, as Detective Hermosillo said, at a high rate of speed. So they went out, they stopped him, arrested him, and that he's been in custody ever since. So almost 4 years now. And he also waived his right to a speedy trial. So that way, I guess, to prepare longer. Lori did not waive her right to a speedy trial, which meant they had less time to put together a case. And that's probably one reason why the death penalty was taken off the table for her. So that is where they ended the day. Kind of an intense way to end. They're starting up again Thursday morning, bright and early, 8:30, and then they'll go to about 3:30-ish in the afternoon. He says, Judge Boy says there will be no court on Friday due to some sort of scheduling conflict. Can speculate maybe there was a witness issue or who knows. Don't know. He didn't explain. But they will then Thursday they'll jump to Monday. So I'll have a bit of a break in between. And I have a feeling that I will have no problem. At least my inner Snark once again. Who knows? But in the meantime, enjoy your chocolate because you gotta have something sweet in the middle of all this bitter.